Thank you, Ernest. Thank you, Maggie, for organizing this very interesting conference with lots of substantive and interesting papers. So I'm really looking forward to our next couple of days. Derek started us off, I think, with a wonderful overview, and I guess what I'm going to be talking about is is largely the part about the occupational transformation, sort of the differences in employment and what has been happening with that. I think the focus on the occupational transformation is important from at least two respects. One is ultimately, of course, what we want to be doing is to improve the lives and well-being of people, and so we want to ensure that people are in the right kind of jobs, and what that means is the relatively productive, better, high-wage jobs. So looking at economic development from the perspective of the occupational transformation or the employment transformation directly ties up with our concern for inclusion and overall well-being, besides just productivity and economic growth. But the second link is the one that I will be focusing on perhaps more, is the link with the occupational transformation and economic growth or overall economic productivity. Because the same process that means that moves people from low productivity to high productivity jobs is also the process that increases the economy's overall productivity, and therefore is an engine of economic growth. So to link, I should have said, by the way, at the outset that I'm reporting here on a research project that Maggie McMillan and I are doing jointly with support from IFPRI. So this is joint work. Linking this up with the traditional literature on economic growth, when the literature on economic growth came out from the work of Solow and then others, with largely a focus on the kinds of concerns of the advanced countries. The concern there, the central concern in that literature, was about a convergence between countries that were somewhat below the frontier and countries that were sort of at the frontier, looking at the process of convergence across countries, across economies, and trying to understand that. This focus on the employment transformation or structural transformation within countries looks at a process of convergence within countries and tries to understand how convergence within countries can actually drive the process of growth. And what I mean by this is that developing countries, and you can see this in a rather dramatic fashion here by looking at the evidence in Africa. The developing countries, and particularly those in Africa, have huge structural gaps in labor productivity in different kinds of sectors. And so this is just a distribution of labor productivity across the 9 or 10 different sectors that we are focusing on, or we've disaggregated economies into. And these huge gaps in productivity mean that just the composition of employment, composition of occupations is going to have very important implications for overall productivity. The way to really, in a way, see this very, I was just thinking about this as we were talking earlier, just look at this conference room or look at this hotel. You could be anywhere in the world. And so if you don't know that you're in Africa or in Ghana, my guess is that if you were to compute labor productivity in this hotel, it's just about the same as what it would be any other similar hotel in any other kind of country. Yet we are in a developing country. And the vast majority of the people in this country are not operating at the kind of productivity that is associated with the people who work in this hotel, but at vastly lower levels. So the challenge of economic development is to get more people to be employed in jobs like this one, where obviously, but what the presence of this hotel shows us is that you can get very high productivity jobs and very high productivity employment sources, even in a developing country, in a very poor country. So it's the challenge of development is not just sort of, necessarily just to raise everybody to the level of the advanced countries, but it's also sort of closing these gaps that already exist within developing countries. So this is, the fact that you have occupations like this is already indicative that this is happening in some parts of the economy. The question is why is not happening in a much more broader based kind of way. These structural gaps are really fundamentally a feature of underdevelopment. So if we look at these differences in labor productivity levels across different countries, they tend to be very high in poor countries, but they tend to sort of close down. They tend to converge over the process of development. So here you have on the horizontal axis is the average income or the average labor productivity in different kinds of countries, moving from the poorest to the richest countries in our sample. And on the vertical axis, we have a measure of the dispersion of labor productivity across different sectors, a coefficient of variation of labor productivity. And you can see how this measure of dispersion shrinks. So it's not like these labor productivity differences completely disappear in the advanced countries, but they are much smaller. I should point, of course, that what you would expect is these differences in labor productivity to vanish at the margin. And what we are showing here is just the average labor productivity. So there's a bit of a slippage here between the economically relevant concept of these convergence gaps within economies and the empirical measure we're using. But even if you try to sort of back out from these averages what the relevant marginals would be, you're still going to get much larger gaps in the developing countries, particularly in Africa, compared to the advanced countries. Linking the employment or the occupational transformation with with overall economic development. One sort of perspective on this that I think is actually quite insightful is to look at how the relative productivity of agriculture changes over the course of development. Here, once again, on the horizontal axis, we have income levels or the output average productivity level of different countries. And on the vertical axis, it's a measure of the productivity, the labor productivity in agriculture relative to labor productivity in the rest of the economy. Okay, so labor productivity in agriculture relative to labor productivity in the rest of the economy. So let's call this relative agricultural labor productivity. What's interesting is that this is a very well-behaved U-shaped kind of a curve that sort of almost reminds you of the Kuznets U-curve, although it's conceptually a somewhat different one, but I think it's actually also linked to it. What this is saying is that the relative productivity of agriculture tends to fall during the early stages of development and then rises again. And this is true not just across countries, but it's also true over time within countries, unlike the Kuznets U-curve for inequality. What does this suggest? It suggests that there are really two key dynamics that take place during successful economic development. The first key dynamic, starting from an economy, let's say like Ethiopia's, which is overwhelmingly agricultural and rural. The first key dynamic is to get some non-agricultural, higher productivity activities going. Often these are going to be urban, but not necessarily always. So you can imagine sort of non-traditional agricultural higher productivity activities as well, such as commercial agriculture, export agriculture, horticulture, as in Ethiopia, and so forth. So what that happens is that the first stage of economic development is when you start to develop certain non-traditional agricultural high productivity activities in the rest of the economy. So what that means is that when you're starting from an economy that is overwhelmingly agricultural and where agriculture doesn't have any particular productivity advantage relative to others simply because there aren't that many other activities, so your sort of the relative productivity of agriculture is close to zero. But as you develop these new activities, the relative productivity of agriculture tends to fall simply because now you have these newer, higher productivity activities. That's the first stage of development, is getting these new activities off the ground. The second stage, which is associated with the rising part of this U curve, is the part of transformation, where there's a convergence within the economy as people leave agriculture and move towards these newer, non-traditional, higher productivity activities, leading to a closing of the gap between the agricultural and non-agricultural parts of the economy. Many African countries are in many ways still at the sort of the downward sloping part of this curve because they haven't developed sufficient new high productivity activities. So you look at the relative productivity of manufacturing in a country like Ghana, for example, is very, very low compared to agriculture and compared to sort of Asian countries or countries at a much higher level of development. So African countries in some sense are still stuck in this sort of downward sloping part of this U curve. Just a brief note on the data that Maggie and I have been using. We took as our starting point the Groningen Growth and Development Center database, which had employment and value-added data for about 27 countries, roughly a third of them from Latin America, a third from Asia, and a third are advanced OECD countries. And then through sort of very painstaking work by Inigo, who's sitting over here, we added a number of countries, 11 additional countries, China, Turkey, and importantly for this conference, around 9 African countries. And following the methods of the Groningen Growth and Development Center as closely as possible for purposes of comparability. The basic approach in putting this data together is that the value added come from national account statistics, while employment comes from household surveys or population censuses. The idea being that for informal employment, which is of course a large part of employment in a lot of these countries, relying on population censuses and household surveys would be much more reliable. Having said that, there are clearly quite severe problems still with these data, including some trends that sort of come up in the data that I'll show you in a little bit. That is somewhat surprising. So we treat this as a really a first a cut at trying to compile a cross-national database where we can look at patterns of broad structural change in a systematic basis. This is you probably cannot read any of this. Our list of countries and some summary statistics the sectoral coverage is shown on this table. We have 9 different sectors. Now you'll see that the price of doing this on an economy-wide basis is that it's a fairly aggregated kind of work. So we're really looking at very broad patterns of structural change. I think this is still useful because a lot of the micro work that has looked at productive transformation or productivity change in countries have you've used disaggregated data, but have focused specifically within manufacturing. And one of the things that we'll see is that you see, if you don't look at economy-wide relations, disaggregated data, but have focused specifically within manufacturing. And one of the things that we'll see is that you see, if you don't look at economy-wide relationships, in particular, what happens as manufacturing becomes, let's say, more productive, but does so at the cost of rationalizing production and shifting relative employment or reducing relative employment. If you don't ask where does those jobs that previously existed in manufacturing go, you don't get necessarily a good picture of the overall impact on productivity of what's happening in some of the more advanced parts of the economy. We use to link up the employment transformation with overall productivity growth, we use a very simple decomposition that says that overall labor productivity growth in an economy can be decomposed into two terms. The two terms here are called within and the structural change components. The within term is simply an average of how much labor productivity growth is increasing within each individual sector. So if a lower scale Y is labor productivity in each individual sector, and the thetas are the employment weights of each individual sector, the first term is simply the weighted average of labor productivity growth in each individual sector. So that's sort of capturing, in a weighted sense, what's happening in each individual sector. And if there were no labor productivity gaps across different sectors, this would be the entire story. If there were no structural labor productivity gaps, then overall labor productivity would simply be the weighted average of labor productivity growth in each sector. But in developing countries, as I've shown you, where there are these very large labor productivity gaps, we have a second term that comes from the reallocation of labor across different kinds of sectors. In particular, if labor moves from low productivity to high productivity activities, this will be an additional positive effect on overall productivity growth. And conversely, if labor is moving from high to low productivity activities, this will be a growth reducing kind of employment change. So the structural change component is simply a measurement of this, where now we're looking at changes in employment shares of different sectors, the delta thetas, weighting each one of them effectively by the relative labor productivity of each sector. So the second term here, the structural change component, is going to be positive if on the whole structural change in the composition of employment it moves in the right direction, and it'll be negative if it is moving in the wrong direction. Now, the traditional dual economy models, which of course sort of embed this idea that there are these very large structural gaps, that there are the modern and the traditional parts of the economy, those, like the Arthur Lewis model or the Rennie and Fay model that Eric mentioned, that during the course of development, what's going to happen is precisely that there's going to be shift of labor from the traditional to the modern, from agriculture to industry and services, from the countryside to the cities. And therefore that the structural change term is going to be a significant part of a significant force driving overall productivity growth. Now, when we first started looking at this, and we were in fact quite a bit stimulated by some previous work that the Inter-American Development Bank had done for Latin America, what we found was that there was this process of structural change had been going in reverse in at least the Latin American part of the world. This shows the numbers from this report from last year from the Inter-American Development Bank that basically shows their numbers with our decomposition and shows that how these two, the within versus structural change components, added up. let's look at the sort of compare the early phase with the current phase. The middle phase there, of course, is the period of the debt crisis where everything went wrong. But compare the early phase, which is sort of loosely associated with the period of import substitution, 1950 to 1975. You can see that there was, if you add up the two components, the blue and the red parts, that there was, pretty healthy labor productivity growth in Latin America during this period. And then if you decompose it between the two components that I just discussed, that about roughly half of this growth in labor productivity was due to the within component, that is sort of increase in each individual sector, improvement in each individual sector, and the other half was due, sort of you get sort of a big chunk of overall economic growth happening because labor was moving from low to high productivity activities. So the traditional sort of the dual economy engine of growth was very much at work in Latin America until the late 1970s. But when we turn to the period since about 1990, the more recent period, the striking thing is that first, overall, of course, Latin American economic growth has been significantly lower than what we had before, but that the reason for this, the overwhelming reason for this, is not because labor productivity growth within sectors has slowed down, but it's actually that now there is growth reducing structural change. That labor is now moving from high to low productivity activities rather than what you expect to happen during the process of development. What is this? What's going on here? This is particularly puzzling in light of a lot of studies of Latin American manufacturing, the part of the economy that is most open to international competition. And typically, what those studies has found that in that part of the economy there has been significant amount of productivity growth, and in particular this productivity growth has been accomplished through a smaller kind of structural change within manufacturing, with the least productive firms, with the least productive plants within manufacturing, shrinking or closing activity services, so that this has been a hugely negative effect on the overall productivity of the economy. So that a micro level, the effect of a positive micro level improved allocation within manufacturing has been more than offset by a hugely negative macro misallocation within the economy. And simply, if you look at what has been happening to allocation within manufacturing, misses this bigger picture. So the question, of course, was this specific to Latin America, this highly surprising outcome specific to Latin America? Has it been specific to perhaps the post-1990 period, that maybe this is not just Latin America, it's been going on elsewhere? When we look at this from a global standpoint, now comparing these various regions, we see that in fact that Africa, unfortunately, with our data, looks very similar to Latin America in this way, in that Africa too, after 1990, has experienced a significantly negative growth-reducing structural change. And we compare that with Asia. You see that Asia is still growing in the traditional kind of way. That it is experiencing not only very healthy within sector productivity growth, but it's also experiencing positive structural change, positive in the sense that people are moving on average in the right direction. Now, comparing Latin America and Africa on the one hand to Asia from this perspective, what's very interesting is that the bulk, something like 2/3 of the difference since 1990 of the overall economic growth of these different regions is accounted for by the contribution of the structural change. The fact that in Latin America and Latin America and Africa, structural change has been a negative contributor, whereas in Asia it remains a positive contributor. So basically, to a first order of approximation, if Latin America and Africa has done so much poorly in the last 15, 20 years compared to Asia, the bulk of this is accounted for by these broad patterns of structural change and how they have tended to be perverse in Latin America and Africa compared to Asia. Now, the bottom bar there is the high-income country, and there you can see that structural change plays very little role. That's not because there isn't a lot of structural change in the high-income countries, but it's because these labor productivity gaps are relatively small, so that even if you have a lot of people moving, for example, there's been a lot of deindustrialization in the high-income countries, but that's of no great consequence to overall productivity because people move from manufacturing to services and their productivity is relatively equivalent, so it doesn't make any difference for overall labor productivity in the economy. These are the actual numbers. These are specific specific countries. I just want to maybe just give a little bit more detail on what's happening and what's sort of behind this kind of result by drawing the comparison between Asia and Latin America. Remember that if you have this component of structural change which is negative, what it is saying is that the correlation between productivity levels of different countries and their employment gains are negative. Whereas a positive structural change would mean that the correlation between productivity levels and employment gains would be positive. Right? And this is exactly what we see when we compare Asia to Latin America, which is that in the case of Asia, these are sort of, you can probably not read it, but on the horizontal axis in these charts, we have the changes in employment shares. And on the vertical axis, we have the relative productivity of each individual sector. Okay? So what you can see in the Asian case is a positively sloped relationship, which is saying that basically people are moving out of agriculture, which is sort of the relatively low productivity activity, into industrial activities and services, which tend to be much more higher productivity. Whereas in a place like Latin America, it's a negatively sloped relationship, and people are on average moving from relatively higher to relatively lower productivity things, including the WRT is wholesale and retail trade, which of course is a lot of where a lot of the informal petty trading activities are located. That's in a lot of countries has been precisely the sectors that have expanded, and the industrial activities have shrunk. Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is much closer to Latin America in this respect than to Asia. Here are some specific countries, just to give you a bit of a finer sense of what's happening in individual countries. A particularly perverse case is the case of Argentina since about 1990. Now, this is the same kind of a chart where, once again, in the horizontal axis, we have the change in employment share, and in the vertical axis, we have the relative productivity of each individual sector. The circle is the relative size of each sector, so the relatively number of people that sector employs. So what has been happening in Argentina? You can see that manufacturing, which has been the sector that has lost the greatest number of people in relative shares, has lost about 6 percentage points in terms of its employment share since 1990, is one of the most productive sectors of the economy, and yet it has shrunk. And which are the sectors that have expanded? They're mostly service sectors, including CSP, SGS is sort of an amalgam of community, private services, and government services. So it's a mix of different kinds of services, including public services. So the government sector is included there. So what's interesting, of course, is that Argentina starting in the early 1990s, through an experiment of radical opening up of the economy, radical liberalization and privatization. And we see that one thing that happened was a very big squeeze on the industrial sector in Argentina as the industrial sector came under intense import competition. Now, if you look at what's happening just from the perspective of productivity performance in Argentinian manufacturing, this was a huge success because the only way that Argentinian manufacturing could survive the early 1990s was by becoming very lean and very productive, by closing down plants that were relatively less productive so they could compete with imports. But of course, what we see, the cost of that has been as Argentinian manufacturing shrank, the workers that were displaced didn't end up in more productive or equally productive activities. They ended up in services that were considerably less productive. So you have this paradox that in many countries in Latin America, including Argentina, you have very good within-sector productivity performance, but overall, in terms of overall TFP, overall labor productivity performance is quite dismal. I should say that this performance in Latin America, in Argentina, has been reversed a little bit since the crisis of 2001, 2002, with the devaluation of the currency. But that reversal hasn't prevented this broad pattern to survive till 2005. This is the case for Brazil, which is a somewhat less extreme case. It's still somewhat negative. I'll just skip that. A few African cases. This is Nigeria, which is a sort of a negative relationship. Again, a very puzzling increase in the share of agricultural employment in the case of Nigeria. And in fact, the sector that seems to have shrunk the most in terms of relative employment is wholesale and retail trade services. Here is Zambia. Once again, a relatively large increase in agricultural employment, if the numbers are to be believed. And this is really, occupational transformation in reverse, if you really believe these numbers. Ghana looks actually better. Ghana looks much more like the traditional case, which is that agriculture has shrunk in terms of its employment share. And if you look at, if you see manufacturing all the way out to the right, manufacturing has increased its employment share in the Ghanaian economy. But the problem, of course, is that manufacturing is still a relatively low productivity activity in Ghana. So this is what I mean by countries like Ghana still being stuck at the sort of the downward sloping part of that U-shaped relationship, is that there's still not enough new higher productivity activities as here, unlike sort of except for a few highly capital intensive sectors like minerals and public utilities. Now, sort of look at what these pictures are really supposed to look like from the standpoint of traditional development theory. You have to turn to Asia. Because once you turn to Asia, you see what these are really supposed to look like. This is India, a movement of people out of agriculture into a whole bunch of industrial and service activities in the urban areas. Okay, so this is sort of the archetypal pattern of economic development that you do want to observe. And even a country like Thailand, which is significantly less poor than India, we have very much the same kind of pattern. Once again, the movement out of agriculture into industry and higher productivity services really dominates the overall pattern of structural change. I probably have gone to, if I'm allowed just 5 more minutes, I want to say a little bit on a few hypotheses about what might explain these patterns. So 4 different hypotheses about why there might be these differences across countries. So one possibility is the one that occurred to us initially was that, well, maybe different countries are starting from different initial points, namely that some countries have more surplus labor in agriculture than others, and those countries that have more surplus labor than others are naturally better positioned to take advantage of this pattern of positive structural change. Now, this idea, it turns out, isn't borne out in the data because if you look at if you look at the left, the scatter plot on the left, which is the unconditional relationship between the size of the structural change term, how much structural change contributes to productivity growth, which is what's on the vertical axis, and the initial share of labor, initial share of employment in agriculture, which is on the horizontal axis. This unconditional relationship has a correlation of about 0. So it doesn't matter if you just look at the strict, simple correlation between how many people you have in agriculture and whether you are going to get enough of them out into higher productivity activities. There's no relationship. It's only after you control for a number of things that you get this positive relationship between surplus labor and the potential of and the actual contribution of structural change. So this, in some sense, harks back to the literature on economic growth, where we know that across countries, convergence isn't unconditional. That is to say, poorer countries don't automatically grow more rapidly than richer countries. It's only after you control for a whole bunch of things, including their policies, that you recover convergence. That is, we have conditional convergence, not unconditional convergence. And we see this very same thing within economies, that within economies you don't have unconditional convergence. It's only after you control for other things that you have some conditional convergence. What other things? We find that there are 3 other things that play a role. One is your pattern of comparative advantage. If you're starting out with a comparative advantage pattern in natural resources, in minerals, in primary products, you're in bad luck. That countries that actually have a predominant specialization in primary products tend to not benefit from this positive structural change. And at some level this is very intuitive, because many of these primary products are minerals which don't generate a lot of employment. So even if they are high productivity activities, their capacity, their ability to generate relatively productive jobs for a large enough number of workers in the economy is quite limited compared to economies that have a specialization or comparative advantage in manufacturing and industrial activities. So pattern of comparative advantage seem to be related systematically to this finding. So one reason why Latin America and Africa are doing worse in this respect is clearly linked to their pattern of comparative advantage. But we also find that policies matter, that policies can offset that disadvantage. One of the things where there is some suggestion in the data where policies matter is with respect to labor market policies and labor market rigidity. I think that's less of an issue in Africa. The one that I would emphasize instead are trade and industrial and currency policies, in particular the role of the exchange rate. That we find that very systematically that the undervaluation of the currency helps the positive structural change, and overvaluation of currency hurts. So this is this was the scatter plot with respect to comparative advantage. And this is with respect to currency undervaluation. I should say that all of these come from a regression framework with continent fixed effects, so that we're identifying this relationship not just off of the averages of Asia versus Latin America, but actually off of sort of differences across countries within continents. And so there we do find that even within continents, differences in exchange rate policy have had significant contributory effects. And this is the basic result with respect to the role of the exchange rate. On the horizontal axis, we have a measure of the undervaluation of the currency, and the vertical axis is the part of the contribution of structural change that is not explained by the other variables in the regression. So there's a partial scatter plot. You can see the relationship with sort of countries like China, India, Mauritius, having systematically had more undervalued currencies as part of the explanation for why they've experienced a better structural change or more growth-enhancing structural change. And once again, you can see the link here. The economic idea behind here is very simple, that many of the kinds of higher productivity activities that you want to develop and draw employment and labor into are tradable, non-traditional tradable activities. The exchange rate, or the real exchange rate, is the relative price of those tradable activities, and therefore is a key indicator of the relative profitability of these more productive tradable activities. So if you are able to systematically increase the relative price of these tradable activities, you can increase profitability there, you can generate employment incentives, and get these sectors to grow rather than shrivel or not have enough incentives to grow. So this is, again, sort of a key, I think, policy message that is very important, I think, for sub-Saharan Africa, sort of yet another way of arriving at the relative importance of the exchange rate and avoiding problems of Dutch disease, that when we look at it even from this kind of standpoint. So let me just stop this. I'm sure we'll be discussing many of these issues today and tomorrow.